On May 5, 1886, at a place called Devil's Elbow on the St. Croix River, 15 miles upstream from Stillwater, Minnesota, the spring log drive from the northern pineries came to a stop. Not a slowdown, a stop. A single log, a Norway pine about 40 feet long, had wedged between two rock outcrops on a bend in the river. Behind it, more logs arrived, pushed by the current. They piled against the first log. Then more arrived. And more. Within 6 hours, the jam had grown to several 100,000 logs, a tangled mass of timber 200 feet wide and starting to pile vertically. By the end of the first day, the jam was a quarter-mile long. By the end of the first week, it stretched for half a mile. And by the time it stopped growing, 57 days later, the jam extended for over 2 miles upstream and contained an estimated 150 million board feet of white pine, involved over 200 men working on the logs themselves trying to break it, consumed more than 3 tons of dynamite, and nearly bankrupted the town of Stillwater, the sawmill capital of the St. Croix Valley. The men who stood on that jam didn't have cameras. They didn't have anyone documenting what they were about to face. But you're here now, watching their story unfold. If you believe these impossible achievements deserve to be remembered, if you think the people who built this country with their bare hands and their lives matter, hit subscribe. This channel exists because people like you refuse to let history be forgotten. We're not just watching old stories. We're keeping them alive. This was not a natural event. This was a disaster. An industrial catastrophe measured in stranded capital, lost production, and men dying on a mountain of logs that shifted without warning and swallowed anyone who slipped. This is the story of how America broke the largest log jam in recorded history. Not with machines, not with careful planning, but with explosives, hand tools, brute force, and the kind of desperate, dangerous work that only happens when an entire regional economy is on the verge of collapse. Let's set the stage because the jam didn't happen in isolation. It was the result of a system operating at its absolute limit. The St. Croix River drains over 7,000 square miles of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. In the 1880s, that drainage was one of the most productive logging regions in the world. White pine, Pinus strobus, covered the landscape. These were old-growth forests, trees 150 to 200 years old, some older, standing 100 feet tall with trunks 3 and 4 feet across. Straight, clean wood, perfect for dimensional lumber. Every town being built across the Great Plains, every farmhouse, every barn, every commercial building from Chicago to Denver needed white pine. And the St. Croix Valley was cutting it as fast as humanly possible. The logging system was built on the river. The timber was cut in the winter, 50, 60, sometimes 100 miles upstream from the mills. Logging camps scattered across the drainage, each one employing 30 to 100 men, cutting timber from November through March. The logs were hauled to the riverbanks on sleds, stacked in massive rollways, and left to wait for spring. When the ice went out, usually in late April, the rollways were released. The key logs holding the piles in place were pulled, and thousands of logs would thunder into the river, a controlled avalanche of timber. The current would catch them and push them downstream. The spring melt provided the water volume. In a good year, the St. Croix would rise 6 or 8 feet above its normal level, creating a surge of water that could move millions of logs downstream to the mills at Stillwater and the St. Croix Boom Company sorting works just above the town. But the river was not a calm highway. It twisted, it narrowed, it split around islands. There were rapids, rock outcrops, sharp bends, and at every one of these features, logs could hang up. Small jams were expected. River drivers, the men who rode the logs, worked constantly to keep the drive moving, using peavies and cant hooks to break up jams before they grew. A crew of 20 or 30 drivers could usually handle the normal friction of the drive. But 1886 was not a normal year. The winter cut had been enormous. Over 400 million board feet of timber had been sent to the riverbanks. That's more than 25 million individual logs. When the ice went out, all of that timber hit the river at once. The St. Croix, even in flood, couldn't handle the volume. The The logs packed tight, filling the channel from bank to bank, slowing the current, creating friction. And at Devil's Elbow, a bend in the river where the channel narrowed to less than 150 feet, and the current pushed hard against the outside of the curve, the river finally choked. The jam started small. A few logs wedged against the rocks. The drivers on site tried to break it immediately, prying at the key logs, trying to get the mass moving again. But more logs kept arriving, thousands per hour, pushed by the current and the pressure of millions more logs upstream. The jam grew faster than the crew could work. Within 24 hours, it was beyond the capacity of a small crew. Within a week, it was a geological feature. A solid mass of timber, logs piled 20 and 30 feet high in places, extending upstream for half a mile and still growing. Behind the jam, the river was backing up. Logs were flooding into the tributaries, spilling into the forest, covering fields and roads. The entire log drive, the economic lifeblood of the valley, was stopped. The St. Croix Boom Company, the organization responsible for managing the log drive and sorting the timber by ownership mark before it reached the mills, mobilized immediately. This was an existential threat. If the logs didn't reach the mills couldn't run. If the mills didn't run, they couldn't pay their workers or fulfill their contracts. The entire regional economy would collapse. The Boom Company sent out a call for men, river drivers, lumberjacks, anyone with experience working on logs. The pay was set at $3 a day, double the normal rate, with a $5 bonus for men willing to work the most dangerous sections. Within days, over 200 men had assembled at the jam site. The camp that sprang up near Devil's Elbow was rough even by logging camp standards. Tents and crude shelters built from scrap lumber. No sanitation. Food was brought in by wagon, cooked over open fires, and served in shifts. Beans, pork, bread, coffee. The men worked in rotating crews, 12 hours on, 12 hours off around the clock. There were no days off. The jam wasn't going to break itself. And every day it remained, the financial losses mounted. The Boom Company was paying not just the workers, but also penalties to the mill owners for every day of delay. The mills were contractually obligated to deliver lumber to buyers. If they couldn't deliver, they paid damages. The damages were piling up faster than the logs. The work itself was a nightmare. The jam was not a static pile. It was a mass under tension. The current was still pushing. The logs in the back were pressing against the logs in the front. The weight was enormous. Millions of tons of timber compressed into a space 2 miles long and sometimes 40 feet high. The entire structure was unstable. Logs shifted constantly. A log you were standing on could roll without warning. A section of the jam could let go and surge forward, carrying men with it. And underneath the surface logs was water, cold, fast water, flowing through the gaps in the timber. If you fell through the logs, you went into that water. The current would pull you under the jam and you would drown, trapped beneath tons of wood, your body carried downstream days or weeks later when the jam finally broke. The strategy was to break the jam from the front, to identify the key logs that were holding the mass and remove them, allowing the pressure to release and the timber to start moving again. The jam breakers, the most experienced men, would approach the face of the jam, walking on the logs, probing with their peavies, trying to find the keystones. It was part intuition, part experience. You looked for logs that seemed to be bearing more weight, logs that were bent or compressed, logs that sat at critical angles. Once a key log was identified, the crew would try to work it loose, chop at it with axes, pry at it with peavies and cant hooks. Sometimes they'd attach a cable to it and use a team of horses on the riverbank to pull. If the log came free and the section of the jam started to move, the men had to get off the logs immediately. A releasing jam could accelerate in seconds, logs tumbling and grinding against each other, crushing anything caught in the way. But the size of the jam made this traditional approach nearly impossible. There was no single key log. The mass was too large, too complex. Breaking it one log at a time would take months, maybe years. So the Boom Company made a decision that was both brilliant and insane. They would use dynamite. Explosives had been used in logging before, mostly for clearing debris or blowing up stubborn log jams in narrow canyons. But using dynamite on a jam this size, with men working on the logs, was unprecedented and extraordinarily dangerous. The plan was to drill holes in key logs, pack them with dynamite, set a fuse, and blow the logs apart. The explosion would shatter the log, remove it from the structure, and hopefully release the pressure holding the jam in place. The drilling was done by hand. A crew would identify a target log, usually one near the base of the jam where it was anchored against the rocks. A driller would use a hand auger, a long steel bit turned by a crossbar, to bore a hole into the log. The hole had to be deep, 3 or 4 feet into the wood, to place the charge where it would do the most damage. Drilling a single hole could take an hour. The work was exhausting, as the driller worked standing on the log, bracing himself with one hand, turning the auger with the other. The log was wet, the surface slick. If the log rolled while he was drilling, he went into the water. Once the hole was drilled, a blaster would pack it with dynamite sticks, insert a fuse, and light it. Then everyone got off the jam. Fast. The explosions were spectacular and terrifying. A charge going off inside a log would split the timber into fragments, some of them launched into the air, others driven into the surrounding logs. The blast wave would travel through the jam, causing other logs to shift. Sometimes a single explosion would trigger a cascade, a section of the jam letting go and surging downstream. Other times, the explosion would do nothing visible. The log would shatter, a crater would appear, and the jam would resettle, still holding. It was impossible to predict. The blasters worked by trial and error, increasing the size of the charges, placing them in different locations, trying to find the combination that would break the jam without killing the crew. The danger was constant. Fuses were unpredictable. A fuse that was supposed to burn for 90 seconds might burn in 60. If you were still on the jam when it went off, you were in the blast radius. Flying wood, concussion, and the chaos of logs shifting all around you. Men were injured. A blaster named Michael Hanrahan was caught by a premature explosion on May 18th. The blast threw him off the jam and into the river. He was pulled out downstream, alive, but with a shattered leg and severe burns. He never worked again. Another man, Joseph Ledoux, was crushed when a section of the jam released unexpectedly after a blast. He was standing on a log that rolled, and he fell into the gap between 2 timber layers. The logs closed on him, and by the time the crew could shift the timber and pull him out, he was dead. The work continued, day after day, week after week. The jam was breaking, but slowly. Small sections would release, a few thousand logs would move downstream, and then the jam would resettle. The face would shift forward 100 feet, then stop again. The progress was measured in feet per day, not miles. Meanwhile, the costs were climbing. The boom company was burning through money. Wages for 200 men at $3 a day was $600 a day. Dynamite was expensive, several dollars per pound, and they were using hundreds of pounds per week. Food, equipment, transportation, all of it added up. By the end of May, the company had spent over $30,000, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. And the jam was still there. The town of Stillwater was feeling the pressure. The sawmills had been shut down since early May. Thousands of mill workers were unemployed. The workers had families. The families needed food. The merchants who supplied the town were extending credit, but there was a limit to how long that could last. The town's economy was based on lumber. If the lumber didn't flow, the money didn't flow. Stillwater was on the edge of financial collapse. The mayor and the town council held emergency meetings. There was talk of the state stepping in, of asking for federal assistance, but nothing came of it. The responsibility fell on the boom company and the men at Devil's Elbow. By mid-June, the strategy shifted. Each of the blasters had realized that trying to break the jam from the front was not going to work fast enough. The jam was too deep. The key logs were buried under layers of timber, so they decided to attack it from the sides. Teams of men were sent onto the jam with crosscut saws. Their job was to cut through the logs at the edges of the jam, separating the outer layers from the main mass. Once cut, the outer logs would float free and move downstream, reducing the size of the jam bit by bit. It was slow, brutal work. Sawing through a wet pine log 12 inches in diameter with a crosscut saw took 10 or 15 minutes. The men worked in pairs, one on each end of the saw, pulling in rhythm. Pull, don't push, let the saw do the work. But the logs were soaked, the saws gummed up with sap, and the men were exhausted. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and some men working 7. There were no safety regulations, no limits on hours. You worked until you dropped or until the job was done. The sawing crews faced a unique danger. As they cut through a log at the edge of the jam, the tension in the surrounding timber would shift. Sometimes the log they were cutting would suddenly roll as the weight redistributed. If you didn't let go of the saw in time, it would pull you with it. One sawyer, a man named Lars Anderson, was pulled into the jam when a log he was cutting rolled and took the saw with it. He managed to let go, but he fell into a gap between logs. The current grabbed him and pulled him under. His body was found 3 days later, 2 miles downstream, tangled in a debris pile. Lars Anderson, Patrick Quinn, Joseph Ledoux, Michael Hanrahan. These weren't just names in a company ledger. They were men with families, men who woke up knowing the jam could kill them and went to work anyway. Nobody was filming when they died. No one was there to tell the world what they sacrificed. But we are now. If you think their memory matters, if you believe their courage and their cost deserve to be known, subscribe. You're helping make sure these men are never forgotten. That's not just watching history, that's honoring it. But the method worked. Slowly, the edges of the jam were being whittled away. The outer logs were cut loose and floated downstream. The jam was shrinking. By the end of June, the front of the jam had moved forward nearly half a mile. The channel was starting to open. The dynamite crews continued to blast the core, trying to break the central mass. And finally, we're on June 24th, after 50 days, something gave. A massive blast, one of the largest charges they had set, detonated near the base of the jam. The explosion was heard in Stillwater, 15 miles away. The blast shattered a cluster of key logs, and the pressure that had been building for nearly 2 months was suddenly released. The jam broke. Not all at once, not cleanly, but it broke. A section near the center let go and started to move. The movement triggered a cascade. More logs shifted. More sections released. The timber started flowing downstream, slowly at first, then faster. The men on the jam felt it moving and ran for the banks. Some made it, some didn't. 3 men were carried downstream on the logs, riding the mass as it surged forward. 2 of them made it to shore a mile down. The third, a river driver named Patrick Quinn, fell through the logs and was never seen again. His name was added to the list of men lost to the jam. The breakup continued for 3 days. The timber moved downstream in waves. Massive pulses of logs, hundreds of thousands at a time, pushed by the current and the pressure of the millions of logs still backed up behind. The river drivers worked frantically to keep the logs moving, to prevent new jams from forming downstream. The logs reached the St. Croix boom, the massive log sorting facility just above Stillwater, and the boom crews began the work of sorting the timber by ownership marks. The mills fired up their boilers, the saws started turning, and Stillwater began to breathe again. But the jam wasn't completely broken. A core section, deep entangled, remained at Devil's Elbow. This residual jam was smaller, so maybe a quarter-mile long, but it was still a problem. It was still blocking a significant portion of the channel, and it still contained millions of board feet of timber. The crews went back to work, more drilling, more blasting, more sawing. The final section of the jam was broken in mid-July, 57 days after the jam had first formed. When it was over, the boom company tallied the costs. Over $40,000 spent. That's over $1.2 million in today's money. 6 men confirmed dead, dozens injured, and an estimated 10 to 15 million board feet of timber lost, either destroyed by the blasting or swept downstream and never recovered. But the drive was saved. The logs reached the mills. The lumber was cut and shipped. The contracts were fulfilled, late but fulfilled. Stillwater survived, the boom company survived, and the street. Quah Valley logging industry continued for another 30 years, but the 1886 jam was a turning point. It proved that the system was fragile, that the river had limits, that pushing too many logs through too fast was a gamble, and sometimes you lost. In the years after 1886, the boom company invested in improvements. They blasted rock outcrops at the worst bottlenecks. they built additional booms to control the flow. They hired more river drivers and equipped them with better tools. The goal was to prevent another Devil's Elbow, and for the most part, they succeeded. There were jams in the years that followed, but nothing on the scale of 1886. The men who broke the jam became legends in the logging camps. Patrick Quinn, the man who was lost, was memorialized in a ballad sung in the camps for years after. The Blasters and the Sawyers, the men who had spent 2 months on the logs, were treated as heroes when they came back to town. But most of them didn't see it that way. It was a job, a dangerous, exhausting job that paid well and nearly killed them. When it was over, they took their pay and moved on. Some went back to the logging camps. Some found work in the mills. A few left the industry entirely, deciding that no amount of money was worth the risk. The physical evidence of the jam is mostly gone. Devil's Elbow is still there, a bend in the St. Croix River that looks unremarkable today. The rock outcrops were blasted and removed in the 1890s to improve navigation. The forests along the riverbanks have grown back. There's no marker, no monument to the jam or the men who broke it. But in the local historical societies, in the archives in Stillwater and St. Paul, there are records, company ledgers showing the expenses, newspaper articles from the Stillwater Gazette describing the jam and the efforts to break it, photographs, a few grainy images showing the mass of logs and the tiny figures of men standing on them, dwarfed by the timber. These fragments are all that remain. The legacy of the 1886 jam is written into the history of industrial logging in America. It was the largest log jam ever documented, a disaster that could have destroyed an entire regional economy, but didn't, because men were willing to do work that defied common sense. The use of dynamite to break the jam became standard practice in the industry. In the years that followed, blasting was used on jams across the northern logging regions, in Maine, in Michigan, in the Pacific Northwest. The techniques developed at Devil's Elbow were exported and refined. The knowledge that you could break a massive jam if you had enough explosives and enough men willing to use them changed how the industry approached these disasters. But the human cost was never fully accounted for. 6 men died breaking the 1886 jam. How many were injured but not recorded? How many came away with hearing damage from the blasts, with respiratory problems from working in the wet and cold, with psychological trauma from watching friends die? The records don't say. The men didn't talk about it. You did the work, you survived or you didn't, and you moved on. That was the ethos of the logging camps, and it didn't leave room for reflection or regret. The environmental impact was localized but severe. The jam had backed up water for miles, on flooding forests and fields. When the jam broke, the surge of water and logs scoured the riverbanks, tearing out vegetation, destabilizing the banks, changing the shape of the river. The effects were visible for years. The St. Croix, like all the major logging rivers, was permanently altered by decades of log drives. The drives scoured the riverbed, removed snags and debris that provided fish habitat, and deposited sawdust and bark in quantities that smothered the bottom. By the time the log drives ended in the early 1900s, the river ecosystems were damaged. It would take a century of recovery, dam removals, and habitat restoration before the rivers began to resemble their pre-logging state. But in 1886, none of that mattered. The priority was breaking the jam, getting the logs to the mills, keeping the economy moving. The men who did that work, who spent 57 days on a mountain of timber, using hand tools and explosives, risking their lives every day, were the engine of that economy. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as workers, doing a job, a brutal, dangerous job that someone had to do. And they did it. Walk along the St. Croix today, and it's a quiet river, clean water, forests on both banks, kayakers, and fishermen. It's hard to imagine it choked with logs, a 2-mile-long wall of timber stretching upstream, men crawling over the surface like ants, the sound of saws and explosions echoing off the valley walls. But it happened. In the spring and summer of 1886, the St. Croix was not a river. It was a battlefield. And the men who fought there, who broke the largest log jam in history, Sell left no monuments except the lumber that built a region and the knowledge that it could be done. The cost was measured in lives, in money, in months of brutal labor. But the jam broke, the logs moved, and the industry survived. That's the story. Not heroic, not romantic, just the grinding reality of men and timber and a river that finally reluctantly let go.